Hello everyone, welcome to the Data Platform Summit. Good morning or good evening to wherever you're at in the world today, but happy to have you as part of this. I'm really excited you're here. I'm really excited to be a part of this amazing event, and truly thank you for attending this session today. As if you couldn't see it on the screen, you are in Knowing and Controlling Your Azure Spend. So today we're going to spend some time talking about cost management within the cloud and how do we budget for that? How do we manage those costs? What tools are available to us? And what are some of the tips that we can use to keep those costs down? As I mentioned, my name is Dustin Dorsey. I'm currently Director of Cloud Management and Analytics for LifePoint Health, which is a large hospital network based in the U.S. I've got all of my information on there. If throughout this, once you get finished with this session, if you want to reach out to me, feel free to follow me on my blog. I do occasionally post stuff out there, not a lot, but follow me on social media. Shoot me an email if you have any questions after this. Happy to answer those. I am a speaker, soon to be author. While I do have some posts out on various sites, I do have a book coming out here pretty soon. To hope to have some more information about that, about data migrations to Azure. And then I co-lead the Nashville SQL User Group and SQL Saturday. So if you're ever in the States, when we get those events back up and rolling on a consistent basis, would love to have you as part of those. Just a heads up, there will be a live Q&A at the end of this session. This particular session is pre-recorded. However, I will be following along in the chat to answer any questions you may have. So if you do have any questions, just drop them in the chat throughout the presentation and be happy to respond to those and answer those. Or we can wait till at the end and we can jump on a live Q&A and happy to answer any questions you have then as well. All right, into the content. That's why you're here, right? So just a quick look at the agenda. We're really going to break this up into about 4 core components. The first thing we're going to talk through is we're going to discuss why you should care about cost management. Why does the cloud change this? If you're an engineer in the room, or if you're a DBA or an admin or an analyst, why do you care about cost management? Hopefully if you're here you have a pretty good idea there, but if not, you just happen to stumble in here because it just seemed to be the best session at the time, then hopefully I can bring some clarity to that of why it's really important for us as technical professionals. We're going to talk about how to budget for your move to Azure. Big question a lot of people have is how do we figure out what those costs are and what tools are available to us. And then we're going to go into how to manage the cost once you are in the cloud. And then we're going to look at some different ways that you can do and different programs available and tricks of the trade, if you will, to help lower some of those costs. Because this is a breakout session with a lot of material to cover, I'm not going to be doing any demos, unfortunately, as part of this session. We're just going to talk through it. But if you do get through this and we talk about a tool that you'd really like to see more about it, drop a message in the chat. I can share with you some links where I've done some sessions before that are available out on the web in which I do a much deeper deep dive into some of these. And it should answer a lot of your additional questions there. I can also drop you some links and some articles and things that can help along as well. All right, so going right into this. Well, why should you care? Well, I'd say the first and most important reason that we should care is usually because it's important to the companies that we're working for. If you're fortunate to work for a company where cost has no meaning and they're willing to spend whatever it takes, then congratulations, you're working for a unicorn. Everywhere that I've been and folks that I've talked to, companies are very cost conscientious on some of the decisions they make, especially in terms of like IT, because we're typically one of the biggest spenders within an organization. So knowing and controlling costs is really, really important to them, and it's especially important when it comes to making decisions about cloud usage. Do we move to the cloud? Do we not move to the cloud? Back a few years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago or so, I worked for an organization and we were evaluating the cloud and trying to figure out if it was a decision that we wanted to make as an organization. We went through several talks, we had attended sessions, read lots of materials, and everyone in the organization agreed like the cloud's the right solution. It has what we need. It fits just so many of the needs that we have. Unfortunately, we ended up not making the decision to do it, and the decision actually came down to not understanding how much it was going to cost. It wasn't necessarily that it was so expensive, it was just that no one really knew how much it was going to cost. Like, it was the unknown that actually scared us away. And as a result, we ended up staying on-prem. If you're anything like me, you enjoy being on the latest technologies, you enjoy doing the latest things. So this was a little bit of a disappointment to me in where I was at in my career, because I was really looking forward to be able to do a migration to the cloud. So where do we come in on this as technical professionals, as engineers, as admins? Well, with the cloud, the most equipped person to be able to answer questions about cost is you. It's those folks, it's you all who are part of this session today. You are the ones that have those answers. Now, if you go back and you look at a typical on-prem company, it's pretty common that you may have someone within your organization that's doing procurement. I spent a lot of years as a DBA, and I can remember many conversations in which hardware maintenance was coming up, and someone would come to me and say, "Hey, Dustin, we need to replace some of this hardware for these SQL servers that we have here. We need you to tell us how much CPU, how much memory, how much disk storage you're going to need for the next 3 to 5 years, however long the maintenance was going to go." And I would give them that information, but then it would hand off to someone else, and then someone else would negotiate that with the hardware vendors, whether it be Dell, HP, or some other company that sat in the middle of those. They would go handle those negotiations for us. I didn't have to worry about cost management. I just had to tell someone else what I needed. Well, the cloud changes that, and it changes it quite a lot, because now we have to be procurement. When someone comes and asks a question of, okay, how much is this SQL server going to cost? I can't just hand information off to someone. I'm going to have to be able to answer those questions for them and be able to explain, oh, this is how much this is going to cost. We are the people that are doing procurement now. And when we make changes, I mean, the great thing about the cloud is the ability to scale and to be able to change literally within seconds or within a few clicks. We have to remember that every architectural decision that we make in the cloud has a cost tied to it, and we have to be the ones that communicate that back to our organization. So today, this session, as we walk through some of these tools and some of these tips, like, this session is for you. Like, this session is not necessarily for the directors or above, or those who are trying to negotiate the pricing. This is showing you as a technical professional what tools exist out there for you to be able to use to be able to answer these questions for your organization. So when your VP or someone within your organization comes and says, how much is it going to cost, you're going to be ready to answer those questions. So there are two core components of cost management, the way that I think about these. The first one is determining what it's going to cost to get to the cloud. This is building a budget. So one of the first key questions that a company will ask you before they make the decision to move to cloud technology is, how much is it going to cost? So that's the first core component. The second core component is how to manage the cost once you are running in the cloud. So once I have everything up in there, my cost management doesn't stop. Things can change. You're tweaking things. Like, you don't generally just build something up there and then it's kind of, you just leave it alone. There's work that goes into it, and it's important to still manage the cost once you get into the cloud. We're going to talk about both of these today. Again, I have separate sessions that I do on these individually. So if you are interested in learning a little bit more, just shoot me a message there, and happy to share with you some links for that. All right, so let's go into estimating the cost, building a budget. How do we do this? Well, the first thing I want to note when it comes to building a budget is there's really no easy button here, unfortunately. There are some third-party tools that exist out there, and there are vendors who can absolutely help you with this, but it's going to come at a cost. There's unfortunately no way that I'm familiar of today where you can just take information from your system, you run a tool within your system, and then you plug it into a calculator and it tells you exactly what it's going to cost. There are tools that help you do that, but it's going to take some work. You've got to put some thought into it. You've got to put some consideration into it to make it work. If you just go strictly based on what these tools tell you, you're probably going to end up overspending, and you're going to look at the cost and be like, yeah, there's no way we're doing this. Or your organization's going to look at it and be like, yeah, we'll just stay on-prem. But just know there's no easy button. If you came here today looking for an easy button, then I'll apologize to you, because unfortunately it's not. All right, so getting started. The flat approach is something that I came up with to help folks that I work with on getting started with the cloud. If you're new to the cloud and trying to figure out things, this is an approach that I've found that helps to kind of know where to focus your attention. If you've been in the cloud for a while and you've used lots of the different services and you've spent some time with it, it may not necessarily be applicable to you, but there still may be some points in here that may be pretty good. First thing is, when getting started, that I encourage folks to do is get familiar with it. Get familiar with the services and the impact from the usage. I can give sessions all day. You can listen to other sessions. You can read blog posts. But there's nothing like actually getting in and getting your hands dirty with it and actually understanding it. There's Microsoft or other cloud providers all offer free credits to be able to get in there and play with things. You don't need thousands of dollars to get a handle on how these things operate. You can do it with very small tiers and for very small amounts of money to get familiar with it. Use the free credits. If you're a company that's really looking at investing in this, something that I oftentimes recommend is set aside a small budget just to get started with it, to start learning it, to get your engineers in there and let them make some mistakes. Now, don't go in spinning up a 64 core server to make mistakes with, but work with small tiers and just get used to it. There's also numerous training opportunities out there. The training opportunities do help. It points you in the right direction. Take advantage of that stuff. Anything that helps you get familiar with it is going to equip you even better. The second point is location. So which region should you be in, and are your services supported there? Location also plays a big role in terms of how much latency that you're going to have and what is your user experience going to be like. Typically, you're picking a region that's near to where your users are connecting to it, although there are a lot of factors that can go in there, such as, are you worldwide, are you running worldwide services, or are you domestic, down to a certain place. But there's a lot of decisions that need to go into which location you put it in. Sometimes it's a no-brainer. You're running in Chicago, so you're going to put your services in the Chicago region. But something you will want to consider. There are cost differences on some services between which region you go into. I haven't noticed these to be dramatic. Some of the international ones could be different. I haven't done a lot in the international regions. But you're going to want to look just to see, okay, which one is going to work best for me and how is it going to impact my cost. And most importantly, you want to make sure that the services that you're looking at are actually supported there. Especially some of the newer services, you may find out they don't exist in certain regions, which may change a little bit of how you look at it. From an architecture standpoint, what services work best? What are you going to use? For example, if you're moving a SQL server, what do you use? Do you use Azure SQL DB, a managed instance, a VM, a Synapse SQL pool? And then if you do pick which one of those, do I use DTUs or vCores? Do I use a hyperscale? Do I create elastic pools, and so on and so on? What architecture works best for what I'm doing? It's a good idea before you actually start migrating anything to understand what are the different options and go through and compare some of the costs associated within those. There are today, I believe there are over 200 products and cloud services in Azure, and a lot of these products will overlap, but the costs can be very, very different. So you're going to want to look into those to figure out what is the best solution for what I'm trying to do. Features can play a big role in that, but sometimes the feature sets are very similar enough that it could come down to which one's the most cost efficient for your organization. The last point here is translation. So this is translating your existing workloads to the cloud. What does your existing workload look like today that you may be running on-prem? What does it look like in the cloud? There are a lot of tools that help you with this so you're not on your own. The Data Migration Assistant, Azure Migrate, the Data Migration Guide, the Database Experimentation Assistant, the DTU Calculator, or even your favorite monitoring tools can help you understand this. One big note that I like to put on here about translation is, again, if you haven't had a lot of experience with the cloud, the mindset does change a little bit of how you translate to the cloud. As someone who spent many years as a DBA prior to being in the role that I am in now, I generally like to have quite a bit of room for my SQL servers to have some space in the compute. Like, I typically like to see those running around 30 or 40% compute, because I wanted room in case things spiked up or workloads got higher. Well, in the cloud, you pay for what you consume, what you're using. So whether you use it or not, you're paying for it. So in the cloud, if I'm moving a SQL server, I probably don't want to leave 70% just sitting idle while I'm running, because I'm going to have to pay for that. So I may run those at a little bit higher rate of a 70 or 80% compute. So it's a little bit different sometimes in how you translate those between your on-prem to the cloud. One of the most important, if not the most important tool in your budgeting that you go through in estimating these costs is the Azure Calculator. So every one of the cloud providers have a calculator out there that exists that helps you go through and be able to build your estimates. This tool allows you to better understand your costs of how to operate in the cloud and effectively builds the budget for you. Within this tool, you can go through, you have access to every service that exists within the Azure library that you can add to it, and you can put in values for configurations. So you can specify your compute, you can specify your storage, you can specify a lot of varying things in there that tell you what your cost is going to end up being. One thing I did not mention earlier, especially in terms of familiarity when we were talking about the flat approach, is when you start, again, especially if you're new to this and you're just getting started, that I highly recommend is start slow when you're doing it. I see a lot of companies go through this and they try to migrate large amounts of servers at once. And I understand there's situations that come up to where it may warrant that. But a lot of these companies, if you read about them, end up moving back because they get there and it ends up being way more costly than what they had originally thought. But if you start slow, it gives you an opportunity to learn. When you build estimates through a tool like the Azure Calculator, if you're doing it with just a handful of resources or a few VMs or a few databases, it lets you see how accurate some of those estimates are in terms of the actual. Whereas if you move your entire virtual farm to the cloud all at once as a first exercise, well, if you're way wrong on one VM, you're going to be way wrong on the whole thing. So you want to make sure, or I highly recommend starting slow on this. But the Azure Calculators is, again, it's a great tool. It gives you access to the services. It lets you build out your budgets for what you are going to be moving. Just some important considerations for that calculator. When you're using it, try to be as accurate as possible on what you enter. It's easy to go through it and just throw in some numbers. It's easy to feel like you're being nickeled and dimed too when you go through it, because there's cases on some services where you're charged on reads and writes and number of executions, and it can be difficult to answer those. I will say one of the most expensive components of the cloud is your compute cost. So when you're going through the calculator, you can generally get pretty close if you can get your compute cost on the service that you're using where you need it to be. Some of the reads and writes, yes, some of that stuff can add up, but generally those costs stay relatively small. But if you can have access to that information and you can give good estimates on it, monitoring tools and knowing what that workload looks like currently can help you answer some of those, then you certainly want to try to do that. But you certainly want to try to be as accurate as possible. Don't just go into it and guess, because you're going to end up with you're going to create a budget and it's going to be inaccurate, and if it ends up being too low, then you may have a conversation there with your leadership. Evaluate different architectures. So we talked about there's over 200 services that exist within Azure today, and there's a lot of crossover between what those services do. Try to look at different architectures. When you're building things in the Azure Calculator and you're putting together these costs, try to look at it different ways. Again, you may find out if you're moving a SQL server that a managed instance or a VM may not be your best bet, and you may be able to do it in Azure SQL DB for a lot lower cost. So you're going to want to compare different architectures to look at it and not just go with the first one that comes to mind. Again, there may be feature reasons of you have to go with one, but certainly look at different ones. Use it throughout the analysis process. So a lot of folks that I know will use the calculator and they'll use it to create their original estimate, and then they'll kind of cast it to the side. You can save your estimates within the calculator so that you can revisit them at later times. You can also export that, but use it throughout the process, especially as you're first getting started. If you find out, hey, I inputted something incorrectly, or hey, I misunderstood something, then go back to it and make changes to it, because it helps you learn and understand. Oh, as you learn from the impact, it helps you make adjustments as you add additional things to it in the future. Egress is factored in on the network resources. Just keep that in mind as you go through it. I know with the company that I was telling you about at the beginning of this session, egress was a really scary thing for them. And if you're not familiar with egress, that is data coming out of Azure. There's no cost for data going into Azure, but there is a cost for data coming out of Azure, and that can be, depending on what you're doing, that could be as low as 1 cent a gig, or it could be as high as, I think, up to about 20 cents a gig. If you're pulling out terabytes of data and you know you're going to be pulling out terabytes of data, you're really going to want to factor that. If it's just reports and users pulling small amounts of data out, it may not be a big deal. But just know that egress, you can factor it in the calculator, but it's going to be done on your network resources on there. Hit the save button when you're making changes. I can't tell you how many times I've created things in the calculator and I've forgotten to hit that save button, and I went back and it was all gone. The worst thing you can do is, spend half a day going in there, inputting information, feeling good about what you did, only to close your browser window and not hit the save button, and then lose everything you have. It's a very sad day. It's disappointing, makes you angry. So just make sure you always hit that save button whenever you're using that calculator. And then the last point that I'll mention here is it can be tough to get exact on here. It's some of it you're gonna find things that you don't necessarily understand or have trouble putting in the value, so it's tough to get exact. You want to be as close as possible, like I mentioned, on anything related to compute, because that's generally your highest cost. But you can usually get within, I would say, within about a 10 to 20% range. I usually will, before I communicate it, I'll usually add a buffer in there of 10 to 20%. That could be too high depending on the size of what you're looking at. But just don't build budgets and then take it to your leadership and say this is exactly what we're going to spend. Make sure that they understand there may be some flex in there. There may be some learning. Like, it can get you pretty close, but it may not necessarily be exact. There are some other calculators and tools that are available also to help you. The first one I want to note is the Azure Pricing Guide. So there is the Azure Calculator, and when you use the calculator, there's lots of little notes and things that you can pop open to look for information on it. So if you see something that's like, I really don't understand what this means or what they're looking for here, the Azure Pricing Guide can give you some more information about that. It can give you a lot of detailed information about pricing to help you better understand it. So I generally really recommend, as you're using the calculator, also pull up the Azure Pricing Guide and be looking at that as well to make sure that you understand what you're putting in there to it. The TCO calculator, or Total Cost of Ownership calculator, is a tool that allows you to compare your on-prem costs to the cloud. So if your organization is looking at this from the perspective of, we want to move to the cloud because we think we can save money, this is a tool that can help you do that. Now, what the TCO calculator does is it looks at maybe some of the factors that we don't necessarily always think about, like what is our electricity cost? What is our HVAC cost? What is our rack rental cost if we're renting out data center space? It takes into a lot of detailed factors to allow you to compare it. So it's not just running this VM versus running this VM there. There's a lot more that goes into it. It's a very detailed tool. It can be difficult to gather all of that information to be able to do a fair comparison, but if it's something that, again, that your organization is looking at, it's like, we want to see if this is really going to save us money, it is a great tool to be able to do that. And it will spit out some charts and stuff for you at the end to really show you a good comparison. And to be fair to Microsoft here, that is a Microsoft tool. I have actually gone through the TCO calculator, and I've actually seen where it's more cost efficient to stay on-prem. So it's not always going to tell you that the cloud is always cheaper. The last one here is the DTU calculator. This will help assist in determining the number of DTUs needed for Azure SQL DB. Previously, Azure SQL DB, the only unit that you could use for that was DTUs, but within the past couple years or so, they introduced vCores on Azure SQL DB, which is a little more understanding for us DBAs and other folks. Like, we understand vCores. DTUs are kind of this mystery thing and a blended measure. I still like using the DTU calculator though, because it can actually help you determine the vCore. So it's generally about 100 DTUs equals 1 vCore. So this is a tool that you can use to collect information from a server. You can input it into the calculator. It'll tell you the number of DTUs that are there, and then you can do the conversion to vCores with it as well. So it'll give you a good estimate on it. So that is it for the budgeting. Just to recap a little bit on that, the Azure Calculator is really your home for understanding what these costs are. Get familiar with it, get in there and start playing with some of these services, utilize those free credits, and build your estimates. And use it again throughout the process. As you learn, go back to that tool and apply what you learn as you learn it. So moving into managing your cost. So we talked a little bit about the tools and stuff that allow you to budget, but what happens once you get to Azure and you have services in there running? Well, managing your cloud costs in Azure really kind of is driven by about 4 components. So when we talk about cost management, we focus really on these 4 tenets. The first one being proper planning. The second one being cost visibility, driving accountability, and cost optimization. All really important things. So with proper planning, these are things like governance and due diligence and creating the budgets and estimates, which we just talked about. Cost visibility is making everyone aware of the financial impact their solutions have. We're going to talk about Azure Cost Management in the portal here in a minute, and that's a key. These last 3 are really core components of those. Driving accountability. So this is about stopping bad spending patterns, creating guardrails, educating other folks, educating the team so that you stop making some of these bad mistakes. And then cost optimization. So learning how to do more with less. These components, at least the bottom 3, are the same components. If you read about Azure Cost Management on the Microsoft documentation, it's the same 3 core components that they try to incorporate into the Azure Cost Management tool. But really, if you could sum up managing cloud cost in Azure, really it's about avoiding the surprises. It's about not getting fired or making a bad mistake that could cost us or our company dearly. So we want to make sure that we're managing our costs to the point that when we get that bill, we don't end up with a surprise on it and get called into someone's office and have to explain a decision that maybe we weren't aware of. So proper planning, 2 phases of proper planning. So we've understanding the financial impacts. So this has to do with creating good budgets, understanding the cost before you ever move anything, and then a good governance strategy. So this is one we haven't talked about very much. What do I mean with a good governance strategy? What does governance mean? Well, governance refers to how you manage, monitor, and audit the use of your resources to meet the goals and the requirements of your organization. So So what does this specifically mean in terms of the cloud? So governance can apply to a lot of different things, but what does it specifically mean to the cloud? Well, I think of Azure Governance into 4 key buckets. The first one being resource organization. So how do I model my subscriptions, my resource groups, management groups? What does my naming standards look like? Am I using some sort of tagging associated with this? Resource organization is really key when we get into actually trying to dive through and analyze some of our cost data. So having a good plan here is going to help us later to be able to figure out, okay, where do we have cost issues? Where are we spending the most amount of money? And all of those things are really important to that. Resource security. These are things like RBAC or Azure Policy or resource logs. Resource security is important because we want, one of the best things that we can do to prevent surprises on our bill when we get it is to limit who can actually make these changes and control who can change what, who can create resources. The cloud is amazing because it's scalable. We can create things on a very quickly and spin up services, but if we're not careful with that and we give everyone free reign, it's going to get really expensive really quickly, especially if they don't understand some of the implications of their cost. And then the final 2, auditing and cost controls. Obviously, we're talking about cost controls today. Auditing is a key component of that, knowing what's changed, who's changed it, and having that information available to be able to go and educate others. That is a really quick look at governance. This could be a huge conversation that you could spend a lot of time with. I did reference a link there on the bottom for the Cloud Adoption Framework. If you're not familiar with this, and again, if you're just getting started with the cloud and this is new to you, I highly recommend taking a look at that. There's a lot of pretty much step-by-step build-outs of what you need to do to create good cloud governance, so highly recommend checking that out. So Azure Cost Management. So this is a tool that exists within the portal that allows you to be able to go in and actually see what your costs are. To learn about your cost, to set alerts on your cost, and to really be able to manage it. To access this, you can just go into the portal, you can just type in cost management, it'll pull it up, it'll show up as cost management plus billing. You also may be able to get to it directly through your homepage. There are 4 primary components of Azure Cost Management that make up this. There is cost analysis, budgets, advisor, and bill management. The first 3 we're going to talk about. Bill management is largely outside of the scope of this, but bill management is where you can actually pay your bills via your invoices and do that sort of thing. We're not going to talk so much about that, but we are going to talk about cost analysis, budgets, and the advisor. So what is cost analysis? So cost analysis is an interactive dashboard that allows you to drill through your cost data using a variety of different dimensions. It has a very Power BI-esque feel to it, where you can actually go in and you can actually look to see, how am I trending against my spends? How am I comparing against my budgets? Where am I at this point in the month? How much have I already spent? How much does it project that I'm going to spend for the rest of the month? This is a really great tool to really understand how you are spending and where your costs are going to. You can change the charts. There's a lot of different functionality that exists within this. Again, you can change the granularity. There's lots of different dimension types. So you can look at data based on billing items, resources, subscriptions, resource groups, tags, and so forth. This goes back to where I was talking about resource organization. If you've got good resource organization, then diving through your data based on resource groups or subscriptions or names can be very beneficial in this situation. Tags are also really great with this. Tags are metadata that you can attach to any resource, and you can pretty much use them for whatever you want. So if there's not a built-in item that you like, tags are great for that. I'll often use tags for like environment. So if it's a prod or a dev, or things like who's the owner, departments, things like that, tags are really great for that. But there are some built-in views. You can also fully customize this and dive through it, but a great tool. Just some quick features of cost analysis. It does allow you to analyze cost in a lot of various ways. You can forecast spends. So if it's the middle of the month and you're trying to see how you project out toward the end of the month to see if you need to make any changes, it will show you, it will forecast those spends out for you based on what your current spend has been. You can view spends against budgets. We haven't talked about budgets just yet, but we're going to look at that. You can save and share views. So if you create a view in there, or create a report through there that you really like, you can save that to be able to view it later, or you can share that. It'll create a link for you and you can share it with someone else in the organization. Also, to note, the data is not real time when you're looking at this. So if you're running something and you're trying to see what the real time cost is, unfortunately it doesn't show you that. The tool's, I think, still about 4 hours behind roughly. So if something's going off the rails, you may not necessarily see it immediately. But just know that it's about a 4-hour window there. It can be used to monitor also AWS spend as well. So if you are running in a hybrid cloud environment and you have AWS that you're running services in and you really like this tool, you can set it up to be able to monitor your AWS spend. GCP I don't think is supported yet, but it has been on the roadmap and is likely something that's coming pretty soon. Some quick tips on how to use. So when you're going in here and you're analyzing your cost, these are some things that I will typically look for when I do this. The first one being your actual cost versus your budgeted cost. So how does my current spend compare to my budget? So when I created that stuff in the Azure Calculator before, I can take those numbers and I can actually look to see, okay, how am I actually projecting against those numbers? Am I looking like I'm on par? Did I under or overestimate? Investigate anomalies. So how am I trending? Is there anything unusual? Did I see an unusual spike on a specific service on a certain day and my cost went up? And is that explained? Did someone spend something up without anyone else's knowledge? Or is that an expected behavior? And if it's an unexpected behavior, of immediately going in and taking a look at that. Invoice comparisons, looking at it over periods of time. Are spending habits being changed? Are you adding more to it? Is what you adding again, is it known? Is it understood? And then the fourth one is internal chargeback. So this one goes back a little bit more into the billing, but if you're working within your organization, you can do chargeback to departments. There is some new capabilities that they are adding into Azure Cost Management for this. But the way that we do this is through tags. If you tag your resources with an owner or department, then you can do chargeback through cost analysis and be able to go in there and look at an invoice period and be able to tell whose costs are associated with who, so that when your finance folks go through and do the billing back to departments, you can handle that. So what are budgets? Budgets allow you to track your spending against budgets and create accountability. So what these allow you to do is it allows you to automate some actions when you hit certain thresholds. So I imagine if you guys are anything like me and my team, you're probably really busy and you have a lot of stuff going on and you probably don't have a lot of time to go in and stare at the cost analysis dashboard all the time, every day. It's just, you got other things that you got to do. Well, budgets help us control this without us having to be able to look at it. They actually largely work as an extension of your team. I can go in here and I can configure thresholds and I can set budgets in there, just like, again, back to the budgets that I created in the Azure Calculator, and I can create actions to happen when certain thresholds are met with those. For example, if I've got a budget of $10,000, I may want to set up an action to happen when I hit 80% of that budget. Like I may want to receive an email that says, hey, you've hit 80% of your budget for this month, so that I can go and look into that or make a response to it. I can also use a variety of other different things. So I can set up automation runbooks to run that maybe will turn off services or scale down services. I can create, whatever your ticketing system is, I can create tickets that lets me know that my spend is close to where my budgets are. I have a lot of ability to be able to control actions and automate actions if certain thresholds are built. Within those budgets, I have access to the same resources and dimensions that I have through cost analysis, so I can get pretty detailed in how I set these budgets up. I can do it down to specific services, I can do it down to specific tags, There's a lot of functionality in what I can do with that. And then I have these list of action groups where I can go in and I can trigger actions to happen if certain thresholds have been met. This may be very familiar to you. It's the same action groups that you have with Azure Monitor. The same ones can be applied to budgets. Also, when you look at cost management in the portal, you'll see a tab called Alerts. Alerts are just when something has triggered because of a budget threshold. So if you see alerts within there, typically it's because you've had some sort of response. But you have a lot of ability to be able to automate actions when you hit certain thresholds. The next one is the Azure Advisor. So this is a component of it. Again, very similar if you've used the Azure Advisor on your Azure tenant before, where it looks at a lot of variety factors. It's the same thing. Specifically here, we're looking at cost. So when you're going into Azure Cost Management, you can look at advisor recommendations. What this does is it looks at your current usage and it will provide recommendations or changes that you can make to save money. This does not tell you everything that you can do, but typically it does capture some of the high-level stuff. For instance, if you're running a VM and you're using 10% CPU and you're running on a higher tier, it'll tell you, hey, you're only using a fraction of this resources. You may want to consider scaling it down. It will make recommendations for things like reservations if you have stable workloads. We'll talk about reservations here in a minute. But it will provide some recommendations. I recommend at least just click this and look and see what it's saying, once a month or ever so often, just to see what it says, because it can catch things that maybe you're not seeing. So highly recommend checking that out. One other thing that I want to note, especially in terms of cost analysis, that I really like about this, and maybe it's one of the things that really drives me to really enjoy cost management within the cloud, is performance tuning now produces immediate cost savings. So as a DBA, I used to fix things all the time, and I would tune queries, and I would reduce the number of cores that I was using on a server, which would in turn reduce the amount of licensing, and I'd be so excited about it. But I'd go to my leaders and say, hey, look, we just dropped this from a 24-core to an 8-core server, which is really exciting. But it just never really kind of garnered the excitement that I had when I was telling my leadership this. And a large reason was because even though we were saving licensing and it was a cost avoidance for a future, it wasn't really you weren't seeing an immediate cost saving associated with it. With the cloud, though, if I can go in and I can tune something and I can get it from a 24-core to an 8-core server, well, I can realize those cost savings immediately. And I can go into cost analysis and I can show a resource where we're spending, say $2,000 a month on it, and I cut it down 2/3 or so. I can actually show that to my management, to my other team, and say, hey, look what this performance tuning calls us. We just saved $2,000 a month, or thousands of dollars per month, because I tuned this query. So as DBA, our skills are super valuable when it comes to the cloud, because now it's important for us to go in and tune these things and be more proactive as opposed to reactive, because we're going to see those cost savings immediately. It allows you to show the differences that you're making. So really exciting thing for me as DBAs or admins, like being able to tune the stuff it's just really exciting to be able to show that to others and actually have something that shows where you've made a meaningful difference. For the Azure Cost Management data, if you get into cost analysis and you don't really like the user interface, or you feel like you could build something better, well, guess what? You absolutely can. There is a built-in capability into Power BI where you can connect it into your Azure Cost Management data and be able to pull this data in and do your own stuff with it. This is pretty cool because, again, you can build your own things, but you can also tie it into other data sources that you have. So if you want to combine this data with maybe general ledger data or other data that exists around your budgets and be able to put those two together, you can do some cool things with it. If you're not using Power BI, there are APIs that you can connect to, open APIs, that you can go in and pull this data and do pretty much whatever you want with it at that point. I put a couple of links down there to check those out if that's something that you're interested in. All right, tips for lowering cost. So let's talk through some of these items on how to actually get your cost down. What are some of the programs and what are some common things that I see where people really kind of drive up their costs unnecessarily? First thing is Azure Reservations. So Azure Reservations is a program that Microsoft gives us that helps us save money by committing to a one or 3 year plan. So these exist on a lot of different services. And it's a commitment that you make to them where, hey, we're going to use this service for a 1 or a 3 year period, and in exchange they're going to give you a pretty big discount on it. So these discounts can range up to 70-something% off on your services. So they can make a pretty dramatic difference in what your actual spend is. Just some important notes on Azure Reservations. First is they're self-managed. You don't have to reach out to your Microsoft rep and talk through these, and they don't have to set it up for you. You can do this directly within the portal. If you go in and search for reservations, it'll bring up the screen for you to be able to go through it. So these are all self-managed. You can handle these completely yourself. They're not reserved hardware. Instead, what this program is a commit to spend. So you hear the term reserved VMs, reserved instances, and immediately your mind just goes to, oh, it's reserved hardware. So they're giving us dedicated hardware within their environment. No, unfortunately, that's not the case. What you're saying is we are committing to spend over this allotted amount of time. Azure Reservations are really good for predictable and stabilized workloads. So what do I mean by that? Well, Azure Reservations are applied on an hourly basis. So when you go and you create a reservation on X number of resources, it's applied on an hourly basis, and it is use it or lose it. For example, if I create an Azure Synapse SQL pool and I create a reservation on that, let's say 3,000 DWU, and I take a reservation on 30 units, which would be 3,000 DWU, if I'm not using 3,000 DWU within that hour, well, I'm still paying the same amount. Like, my rate doesn't change at all. It just means that I just didn't use something that I already had. So you want to make sure that if you're doing a lot of fluctuation with a service to where you may be scaling it up, scaling it down, and it's maybe unstabilized, and you're not really sure how much resources you're going to need, reservations may not be your best bet. But if it is pretty stable and it's predictable and you know how much you need, they can be great and save you a whole lot of money. One other note there is if you do go over, I gave the example of on Azure Synapse SQL pool, where if you have a 3,000 DWU, if you do go over your reservation, then you do get the pay-as-you-go rate. So you're going to get charged the full amount over that. So you get the discount on up to what you've reserved, and anything over that you're paying the retail rate. Discounts are applied on an hourly basis for most services. We just talked about this. The only exception, I believe, to this is Azure Databricks, but I believe all of the others that exist are done on an hourly basis. There are no cancellation fees currently, although there has been talk that one could be coming at some point. However, just be aware you're limited by how much you can cancel. So I think the cap right now is $50,000. So don't go in there creating a big reservation thinking you're going to put one over on Microsoft and get a big discount, because you can only cancel so much of it. There are limited coverage, so you will want to check. If you apply a reservation to a service, typically it goes to what the most expensive item is. So we mentioned compute being a really expensive cost. So like with Azure Synapse, if you create a reservation on a Synapse SQL pool, you're getting that reservation on the compute, but you're not getting it on the storage. Some of the services, you are going to want to look at the details on those before you create a reservation to understand what does the reservation actually give me the discount on, because it's typically not everything that's associated with it. All right, moving to Azure Hybrid Benefit. So Azure Hybrid Benefit is a pricing offer that allows you to take your existing on-prem licenses for Windows and SQL Server to Azure. If you're moving from on-prem, it's a good chance, or hopefully, you have licenses for a lot of these things that you're already moving. If it's net new, maybe not, but certainly anything that's getting migrated, you may have licenses for those already. You can take those licenses with you to the cloud. If you don't, you're paying for those licenses as part of the resource cost. So if you have them, you will want to use those because that can be a pretty significant cost savings. Just note, and one of the biggest caveats with this is software assurance is required. So if you've bought your licenses and you didn't buy software assurance, unfortunately you can't take those with you. But if you do have software assurance on them, then you can take those with you. You do also have to continue to pay for that. You can't let software assurance drop once you get moved up there. Another great thing about Azure Hybrid Benefit is it does give you 180 days of dual use for migration purposes. So if there's some time spent on trying to move those over, you do have a little bit of window to get that moved over. There is a calculator for that as well. You can look at it on the Azure calculator, pricing calculator that we talked about a little bit earlier, or there is an actual Azure Hybrid Benefit calculator as well, so you can really get an idea of what those cost savings look like. Manage runtime and scaling. So this is a big one where I see a lot of people have a lot of waste. Turn off or scale down resources when they're not in use. Do your best to only pay for what you need when you need it. Some of this capability, like with VMs, it's built into it. It's just a matter of going in and checking some options if you want to shut it down at a particular time where it's not being used. Other services like Azure SQL DB and some of those don't have this built into it. However, you do have automation runbooks, and there are other tools that exist out there that can allow you to scale these down. Azure SQL DB you can't shut down, but you can scale it down. So if you have a database out there that exists that you need a lot of horsepower in it from, say, in the morning from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. and you scale it up, well, there's no reason to continue paying that high cost for the rest of the day if you don't need that amount of resources. Set up an automation runbook, go in there, you can tier those services down to a lower cost, and you can cut your costs significantly down. If you're interested in that, shoot me a message. I can drop you some PowerShell scripts that I use in our runbooks to help you be able to manage that and get you started. But again, there's numerous resources out on the web that can help with that as well. But make sure you're only paying for what you need. Removing waste. So another big one that I see, and even with having good governance in place, this is still sometimes something easy to slip through the cracks. Audit your existing resources occasionally to see if you have resources that are no longer needed and get rid of them. Our dev environment's a good example of this. We have engineers going in there, they're spinning up services, they're trying out new things, and sometimes they forget about them. They forget to go in and remove them, and they sit there and they sit there and they sit there forever, just running up and incurring cost when no one was ever using them. You can set, use budgets. Budgets can help you track these, especially if it goes way off the rails, but set up time to go in and just audit the resources that you have in there, or have whoever's the owner of these resources go in there and take a look at them to make sure that you're not running things that you don't necessarily need. Azure Dev Test Pricing. So this is another thing, again, that I see a lot of people not take advantage of. If you work for an organization and you have Visual Studio subscriptions, or formerly MSDNs, then you have the ability to take care of a special pricing program within Azure called Dev Test Pricing. So Dev Test is something that's applied when you create a subscription. You select that you want Dev Test, and it gives you up to a 60% saving on some resources. If you're running your prod and your dev environment and you're running them in the same subscription, HandSmack, I recommend separating those out. If you have those Visual Studio subscriptions, you can apply that dev test pricing to that dev environment and get huge savings on it. But just know that when you do apply this, it is exclusive for only development and testing environments, so you can't run your prod in there and get those same savings. Microsoft's going to get onto you and they're going to find that out. Finally, and this is a big one, utilize your partners. So we went through and I hit very high level on a lot of the resources that are available out there for cost management, but it's a big area and there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to get familiar with. Utilize your partners. Especially you may be looking at third-party vendors and you may be bringing in consultants to help you, and that's always great. It comes at a cost. But if you're looking for other ways just to get started, reach out to your Microsoft representative. Let them know, hey, we're thinking about moving to the cloud, and seeing what help they can offer. In my current role that I'm in, I can tell you that some of the things that we've been able to do and how we've been able to do them probably would not have happened without the help of Microsoft. The resources they've plugged us up in with, the information that they've given us has been paramount to our success. Use those guys. They have a huge investment in seeing you succeed, or a huge they want to see you succeed in doing this, because they don't get paid if you don't succeed in doing it. If you stay on-prem, they're losing money as a result of that. So they want to see you succeed. So don't be afraid to ask for help. It's one of the best things that you can do. And then if you get into it and it's more complicated, or you just aren't sure, again, there's numerous consultants. There's consultants at this conference who could absolutely help you. There's lots of other things out there that can get you through to it. So what have we learned today? So we went through a lot of different items pretty quickly. We learned why cost management is important to the technical professional. Why do we as engineers care about this? We talked through some of the tools available to build estimates and to evaluate cost. We talked through the important role that Azure Cost Management plays in controlling and monitoring our spends. So using things like cost analysis, budgets, looking at the advisor recommendations. And then we learned about several things that we can do to lower our cost, taking advantage of programs like reservations, Azure Hybrid Benefit, dev test pricing, and just doing some simple things like auditing our environment, and removing waste, and putting in processes that scale and turn off resources when they're not in use. These are all really important things. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this session today. Again, I'm in the chat if you have any questions. We will also jump into a live Q&A in which I can talk through anything that you want to talk through there, any additional questions that you have. Be happy to do that. Lastly, special thanks to Microsoft for supporting this. Huge thanks to the organizers of this event. They've done a tremendous job, put a tremendous amount of work in making this happen, so thank you. And most importantly, thank you, the attendees, for being part of this session, for being a part of this great event. On your screens, a couple ways to win prizes. Check that out. Be sure to give session and conference feedback. It's really important to the success of these going forward. And visit the sponsors and exhibitors. These events don't happen without their support. And with that, thank you very much.